Today, we are extremely delighted to have two eminent speakers who have excellent reputation in researching this particular area of innovation, patents, intellectual property, and productivity growth. And although I know that most people participating in this seminar know Christine, and they also know Damian, it is in order to make a short introduction of the two speakers. So I start with our very own Christine Oughton, who is a professor of management economics here in the School of Finance and Management at SOAS, University of London, is indeed a member, the founding member of the Center for Global Finance here at SOAS, University of London. He's also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He has many distinguished credentials, including her PhDs from in economics from the University of Cambridge. And before joining SOAS, he was professor of economics and management at the University of Bolzano and professor of management at Birkbeck. She's talking to us today about her main area of work on innovation, but she has also done very path-breaking work on environmental management and economics, industrial policy, corporate governance, financial inclusion and growth, and so on and so forth. And her resume is a very long one, but I also, just to say that she has led a number of research projects here at SOAS University of London. She's also on the board of a number of organizations, including being serving on the board of Financial Inclusion Forum and Academy Industry Network. And in this presentation today, she's presenting joint work with the Dr. Damian Tobin, who until recently was with us here at SOAS University of London, but now is a lecturer in international business at Cork University Business School. And his research focuses on similar to Christina did on technological innovation, technology diffusion, internationalization, economic development issues, and has had a publication featuring in some of the prestigious journals in the world. He's a graduate of the University of Limerick, and of course, our very own institution where he got his PhD in finance and management from this university. Okay, and it's a great pleasure to have both Christine and Damian share with us their research and innovation, and I say they are leading researchers in this particular area. So please join me to welcome both Christine and Damian today to share with us their research. Thank you. You have the floor, Christine, Damian.
Okay, thank you very much, Victor, for those kind words of introduction. I'm going to start off and then hand over to Damian, and because of we've got exam board meetings and things going on today, I might have to leave before the end. In fact, I probably will have to leave before the end in order to make those meetings. But this paper is on innovations, patents, intellectual property rights and productivity growth. And the starting point for the paper, the motivation, is sort of an observation that over the past decade or more, productivity growth has slowed in advanced, emerging and developing economies. It's not just an advanced economy issue. So it's trying to get to understand what is going on and why productivity growth has slowed. The productivity is still increasing most years, but at a slower rate on trend. And various hypotheses have been put forward and considered in the literature, including one that will consider that we're kind of running out of ideas, and we'll present some evidence on whether we think that is the case. That work was published in the American Economic Review in 2020 by Bloom and a number of other authors. Our explanation is going to be slightly different. It's that it's not about the ideas. Actually, when we look at patents, the number of innovations patented, the applications, and the number of patents awarded, which means that they must be deemed to have made a significant increase in originality, has been going up, and there's no sign of that slowing down. Our explanation is that it may be to do with the institutional and governance of intellectual property rights, and may be a significant factor in reining in productivity growth. So this graph shows, this is from the World Bank indicators dataset, the graph showing over the past, since 1981 to fairly recently in 2018, the rate of productivity growth for the world, for advanced economies, the world in blue, and for emerging market and developing economies. And you see, one thing that stands out in that graph is that on trend, the orange line up until around 2007, 8, the financial crisis, the orange line on trend is increasing faster than the others. There's still positive productivity growth in the red line, the advanced economies, and on average in the world economy, until we hit the financial crisis. You see the effect of the financial crisis on productivity growth in 2008, as the crisis spread from the financial sector to the real part of the economy. And that relationship is sort of a well-known relationship between the rate of growth of productivity and the rate of growth of GDP. So as GDP declines, it tends to drag down productivity because of scale effects and so on. Then you see the recovery after the financial crisis, but since then, a decline. And it's that decline for the advanced economies that the paper by Bloom focuses on, but it's also a decline in emerging and developing economies. So it's not unique to the US, although the paper by Bloom tends to focus on the US. So that's the sort of issue that needs to be explained. Why has productivity slowed? And the sort of various explanations. One is I've touched on the global financial crisis and a prolonged period of slow growth in advanced economies. Another explanation is more of the shocks-based one that you see with that big dip in the financial crisis. I guess more recently, successive shocks building on that COVID war and natural disasters, some of which may have prolonged effect. And it may be that convergence and catch-up, particularly for low-income countries, is much harder to achieve now in this low-growth environment, and a growth environment punctuated by sporadic shocks and recession. It may be harder for low-income and middle-income countries to catch up. The fastest rate of convergence we saw in GDP per capita across countries was in the long post-war boom, sometimes called the golden age of economic growth, from 1950 to 1973. And in that period of growth, we saw more convergence. When growth slowed after the first oil crisis in 73, 74, and later in the second oil crisis in the early 80s, and then the recessions of the early 80s, convergence also slowed. So it seems to be easier to catch up when economies are growing fast, or certainly historically that was the case. The other sort of stylized fact is that productivity growth in services tends to be slower than productivity growth in industry. And that means that for advanced economies, as they shift more towards services, that sector shift drags down the average productivity growth. Of course, for developing economies, as they shift resources from the primary sector into industry and services at the same time, but mainly into industry, that can lead to higher productivity growth because of these sectoral differences in rates of product opportunities for productivity growth and technological change. So those are kind of just stylized facts. I guess many of you may be familiar with them. In terms of more specific studies that are trying to address this productivity paradox, that productivity growth has slowed at a time of rapid technological change. If we think of all the changes of digitalization, you might think that why is productivity slowing down? Recent technological change may differ, all the digitalization and ICT change, to the transformative technological change of the past. And I guess an early writer on this was Cornwall in his book Transformation and Growth, where he was focusing on very significant changes in technology around vehicles, well, initially the railways, but then the vehicles and kind of mechanization of production systems and so on. And more recent technological change has tended to focus on a lot on ICT and digitalization. The other big change, of course, in the post-war period was all of the technological change that came from the space program, which led to the microchip. And you might think that is going to go on and lead to changes, but it doesn't seem to have done in the same way as the discovery of the internal combustion engine and so on. Another explanation that's put forward in the literature, so something different about the nature of technological change now compared to pre-1980. The other explanation is business models have not changed in step with technological change, and we don't have appropriate business models to deal with digitalization. We haven't changed our business organization to make use of changes in technology, or some of these changes in technology from digitalization may actually slow down productivity. I can think of some in my own area where you do something digitalized that you would have done not digitalized through computers. It actually doesn't save time, it might create more work. A third explanation is that slower diffusion from advanced to developing economies occasioned by managerial quality and a lack of absorptive capacity. So it's not the rate of ideas that slowed down, it's not the nature of the ideas that slowed down, it's the diffusion of those ideas and the ability of companies to absorb ideas. So ideas get created in a few leading companies, they need to be rapidly diffused to lagging companies and countries. But if there isn't absorptive capacity, managerial capability in those companies, the ideas don't get absorbed and diffused properly. And the other explanation, so those are three explanations of the sort of productivity paradox. Why is productivity slowing at a time of rapid technological change? The other explanation, which is quite different in some ways, it's sort of saying we're running out of ideas. It's not that we've got all these ideas and they're not being diffused and bringing benefits to society. It's actually saying we're running out of ideas and the research sector is somehow less productive than it has been in the past. And I will just cover these slides and next two slides on that, and then hand over to Damian, who can pick up on these slides as well in our handover. So this graph is taken from the paper by Bloom, and what it shows is ostensibly the effective number of researchers on the right-hand scale, and the factor increased since 1930 up to 2000s, and then it shows something called US total factor productivity growth on the left-hand scale. And total factor productivity growth, you may remember, is the residual in a growth accounting model. It's that bit of productivity growth that is not explained by inputs of capital and labour. It's the residual, or what Arrow called a measure of our ignorance. It's the bit that comes from technological change, but now it's recognised that it also comes from organisation and governance systems as well. It's not just technology driven. The graph is, it's got very different scales on these axes. So total factor productivity growth is still positive throughout this whole period, although you can see there's a slight downward trend. What's perhaps more remarkable on this graph, and it may be a scaling effect, this is just taken from their article directly, is this effective number of researchers index or measure, which is actually not the effective number of researchers. It is, if you read the note below, it's gross domestic investment in intellectual property products from national accounts. deflated by a measure for the nominal wage for high-skilled workers. In other words, it's really a measure of real R&D and intellectual property expenditure. And in that measure, it is research and development expenditure. But in that measure they single out research and development expenditure on information and communications technologies, ICT. And in ICT, they single out payments made to purchase into ICT technologies, which are really royalties on software. And that has been increasing, and that reflects in some ways the digital revolution, but it's also a cost to business because all of those software products, as we know, are protected, or most of them. There's some in the public domain, but many of them are protected software ICT products. So we've got this measure of R&D spend and a measure of total factor productivity growth. In the next slide, they put these two things together, and they say that the ratio of those two graphs that I've just shown you, total factor productivity growth divided by R&D effective researchers, which is on this graph as well, we've got the same line reproduced here, is very rapidly falling downhill. And so that leaves a question really about, are these measures of effective number of researchers appropriate measures? And is total factor productivity growth, which is a residual from a growth accounting equation, simply taking proportionate rates of change weighted by factor shares, you know, the story. Is that really a reflection of what's going on in terms of the productivity of research? Is that a correct reflection? Because we've done some work, and Damian will explain it, to suggest that is not the case. And just one slide that will be our handover slide as I hand over to Damian, that I'll start with, and Damian can pick up on, is that this graph shows total factor productivity growth using OECD data for the United States, and the which shows multi-factor productivity. It's the orange bit, and you get a very different picture when you look at this graph to when you look at the one in blue. So, Damian, is it okay if I hand over to you now and you grab control and take everyone forward?
Yeah, thanks very much, Christine. I hope everybody can see the slides changing as I go through them. So as Christine pointed out, the first chart there on TFP that she's highlighted, I suppose that's one question mark that we raise on their particular claim. I suppose the other was the sort of short time period in which they looked at their data seemed to stop in the early 2000s. We also had a look at data on, I suppose, the actual number of researchers as opposed to a measure of the effective number of researchers and its relationship to US productivity. And it's quite interesting if you look at data from 2000 onwards, those two pieces of data, the number of US researchers per million of population and US productivity data from the FRED database, they seem to run pretty much in line with each other. There's some parts where they depart, but in general, I think they run in trend with each other. So I suppose that led us to think about, you know, broader measures of research and productivity. The next one we looked at was a ratio of GDP per capita and research as a percentage of GDP for the US between 1996 and 2020. And again, you know, those two data trends tend to run in tandem with each other. I suppose there are obvious parts where the data depart, but I think that can be accounted for by, I suppose, the different I suppose, research funding and stuff like that. But broadly, those two pieces of data tend to run in line with each other. That led us to think about alternative explanations in the literature for why I suppose Bloom get the result they do. The first one we really looked at is this area of the patents paradox, and the patents paradox was first explored by Joan Robinson and in her book Accumulation of Capital in 1956, where she made the point that a patent is something that is designed by its very nature to slow down the diffusion of an invention. So there's a sort of a paradoxical element to a patent in that whereas it's designed for technical progress, in fact, in order for the inventor to appropriate some of the benefits of the invention, we slow down diffusion. So we have what's called a patents paradox. The second alternative, I suppose, explanation in the literature is Schumpeter's idea, and I suppose a lot of us would be familiar with the transition from Schumpeter 1 to Schumpeter 2 innovation regimes. But Schumpeter, I suppose, was basically arguing that, in a sense, there's a shift in the nature of an innovation, or there has been a shift in the nature of innovation, as we go through the life cycle of a product, from one which is characterized by an entrepreneurial spirit towards one characterized by trustified capitalism. And I suppose the interesting feature of trustified capitalism is the one where most innovation takes place within large organizations. And the net effect of that is that it allows big business to appropriate more of the returns from innovation. So again, this could help us explain an increase, how we can have an increase in innovation without necessarily having a corresponding increase in diffusion of new ideas. The third explanation in the literature, and it's probably one that draws on our own research published in Cambridge Journal of Economics, is the changes in institutional environment, particularly around the use of patents and intellectual property rights and TRIPS as a way, I suppose, of increasing the appropriation from inventions. And again, I suppose we'll show data later which shows that you can almost see from the initiation of the TRIPS agreement, a corresponding and rapid increase in the level and use of the patent system. I think that's reflected in a lot of companies as well, where a lot of companies spend time flying around the world defending their intellectual property as part of their business strategy. So that an aspect of that is that there's a greater incentive in the institutional environment for government-funded business R&D to be appropriated by business, particularly if we think about the biomedical and pharma sectors, where I suppose a lot of projects are developed as collaborations between government and industry, but industry appropriates more of the rents or the rewards from that. A fourth feature which we examined was the changes in the innovation system and triple helix, particularly of government, industry, and university investment in research and development. So again, this refers to the idea, I suppose, that government research and development has historically focused on large blue sky questions, everything from space travel, and there has been, I suppose, a very positive public knowledge aspect of that, where the findings of this tend to be spun out quicker for civil use. So again, a lot of the big inventions historically, or a lot of the big technologies historically, have typically come from initially government-funded research that has been spun out quite quickly and diffused quite quickly. So again, changes in that innovation system could, in theory, slow down the rate of diffusion of new inventions. The final factor that we looked at, and I think it's one that has been overlooked a lot in the literature, is the role of the factorial distribution of income, and in particular the decline in the wage share. I think, you know, a lot of us who've looked at that will be aware of the declining wage share in income. But I think less explored is the role of that as a spur to innovation. So again, Robinson mentioned that in her 1939 work. There's also work by Baduri who models it and shows that, you know, essentially, you know, the wage spur has a double-sided effect, both as a spur to technical change and a driver of increased demand. And finally, Akinmoglu and Johnson, in their recent, I suppose, blockbuster book, I think it's Power and Progress, they describe historically how you know, higher wages, particularly in the US and later in the UK, spurred innovation in a lot of technologies, and were essentially the spur for the adoption of automation in a lot of different processes. That the existence of higher wages essentially spurred businesses to automate and innovate faster. So there's a lot of, I suppose, both economic and historical evidence there to support the idea of the wage share as a spur to innovation. So just to go through some of these factors. So one of the things we did to look at this was we showed that there has been an increase in the use of patents there's been a decline. In terms of the Bloom piece, you know, we can find little evidence that of a decline in ideas. So if we look at this chart here, which is US patents per unit of GDP of industry spend on R&D, you know, you can see that continual upward trend. So, you know, I think on balance, you know, we found it difficult to find evidence, at least using patents as a measure of new inventions, of a decline in new ideas. It's quite interesting when you look at that relationship across different categories or different categories of development, particularly income levels across high income, upper middle income, lower middle income, and lower income countries. What's interesting, I think, is that, you know, there is evidence of increased investment, at least in research and development, higher income, upper middle income, and lower middle income countries. And this suggests to us that, at least internationally, there is little evidence of a decline in ideas, which is the Bloom thesis in the US. And also higher income countries more generally, as well as upper middle and lower middle income countries. In fact, what we see, particularly in higher income, upper middle income, and lower middle income countries, is an increased investment in intellectual property and patents. So actually, these three categories of countries are using patents to a greater extent. And there's some very interesting data on China's use of patents. So China has become, or accounted, I suppose, for an increasing share of patents, of US patents, or patents registered in the US. And that has actually grown very similar to the way German patents in the US increased, you know, earlier on when Germany was going through its rapid period of growth. So again, China seems to be using the patent system in a very similar way. Just to show you some of the evidence of that, we have 4 charts here based on the high, upper middle, lower middle, and low income countries. And I think that essentially reinforces our point that there does seem to be this relationship between researchers per million and the level of patenting across the first 3 categories of countries. Now you see for upper middle income, there is a gap between the number of researchers and the patents applied in the earlier years. We think that could be due to, I suppose, companies increasingly patenting their inventions in upper middle income countries. So we know that, you know, a lot of particularly upper middle income countries would have innovation systems which are patent or TRIPS compliant, which allows, I suppose, companies to patent their innovations in those countries. So we think the higher level of patenting than researchers in those countries could be due to that. The only chart we're slightly puzzled by, I suppose, is the low-income countries, where there is initially a big gap between patenting and the number of researchers. There's a big jump then in the number of patenting, and then there's a fall off in the number of patenting. That would suggest that low-income countries are using the patenting system less. I think the blip in the middle could be a data issue. You know, there could be an outlying observation in there. We're not quite sure of that yet, but it's certainly something we want to look into further. With regard to the US data, what we've done here is essentially rerun, I suppose, the piece of data on investment in intellectual property assets or products used in the or referred to in the Bloom paper, and we've compared that to the number of patents granted in the US. And I think the interesting point on that is the trend change around the start of TRIPS. So if you look back to 1 year after TRIPS, so 1996, 1997, you can see that there's a takeoff in the level of both patent applications and a significant increase in fixed investment in intellectual property products. So again, that seems to suggest that, you know, US companies are increasingly patenting and using intellectual property assets as a way of, I suppose, appropriating or achieving greater appropriation from that patenting activity. The opposite seems to be happening in the government sector. So again, we were quite surprised by this result when we looked at US patents from federal agencies. So federal patenting or patenting by US research or US federal research agencies seem to grow from the 2000s onwards in line with other patents. What seems to have happened from about 2014, 2015 onwards is that patenting activity seems to have peaked and gone into decline. So something has happened in terms of government or the activity of federal agencies in terms of patenting. So they're applying for far less patents, and their investment in intellectual property assets seems to have more or less flatlined or increased very slightly. Our final issue, or our final factor that we looked at, was the changes in the factorial distribution of income, i.e. the wage share, and its relationship to industry research and development. Again, I'll just summarize that research the main points from that in this slide. In the private sector, we seem to find that the relationship between the wage share and research and development switches from a negative one pre-TRIPS to a positive one post-TRIPS. So I'll just fast forward to the slide which shows that. You can see on the slide on your left, to the left of the slide, or on the graph to the left of the slide, you can see industry funding of research and development and the total wage share. So that's the total wage share for the US economy, i.e. all sectors. You can see there's a slight inflection, or there's a significant inflection point around just around the start of TRIPS, where the relationship turns from an inverse one or negative one to one where the wage share and funding of research and development, industry funding of research and development, seems to go hand in hand. That relationship is more obvious when you focus specifically on industry, private business in the business sector, funding of research and development, and the wage share for the business sector. You can see that post-TRIPS or post-1995 onwards, the wage share and the funding of research and development in the business sector seems to go hand in hand. So that raises an interesting question around what is spurring what, whether it's the wage share is spurring investment in research and development, or whether, I suppose, workers in that sector are appropriating more of the returns from intellectual property or patenting activities. The second, I suppose, feature of the data that we found is that in the government sector, the relationship between the wage share and research and development is positive on trend throughout, in the sense that central government and patenting grew until about 2016 and then suddenly seems to have declined sharply. So I'll just go forward to that slide here. So this is US federal funding of research and development and the wage share. And you can see that the relationship between those two variables is fairly constant throughout, i.e. it's in decline. So there's a falling wage share, a falling share of wages and salaries in federal agencies as a share of GDP, and the fall in US funding of research and development. So less funding, less wage share. And that, I suppose, corresponds to our patenting data for federal agencies in the US. I suppose there's two possible explanatory factors for that. The first is that both government research and research and development funding and wages as spurs to innovation are both declining in GDP. So there's nothing there effectively to spur greater innovation in the government sector. The second one is maybe that in the private sector, the positive relationship between wages or the wage share and research and development may reflect a spur to innovation, or it's the outcome of higher appropriation by the private sector employees of intellectual property rents. So it's essentially, I suppose, research activities within the private business sector have a greater incentive to appropriate some of the gains from collaborations with the government sector. So I think these are our two possible explanations. To sum up, we have 5, I suppose, bullet points in terms of our main conclusions and the potential implications of those. Our first one is that from what we can see, there's little evidence of a decline in ideas or research effort. So again, I think we are really discounting the idea that there has been a decline in ideas or research effort. Rather, what seems to have happened instead is that there has been a significant growth in the use of patents and intellectual property protection post-TRIPS. So this has allowed, I suppose, corporations or the business sector to appropriate more of the rents of innovation. The key factor here, I suppose, is that because most of the gains from innovations come from diffusion of those innovations, not from the inventions themselves, I suppose the fact that those innovations are not flowing through to society is, or potentially is, impacting on productivity growth. So we're getting the inventions, but we're not getting the diffusion. So essentially what we're arguing, I suppose, is that the decline in productivity that some of these papers are documenting could reflect slower diffusion as a result of increased use of intellectual property protection, particularly in high and upper middle income countries. This, I suppose, leads us to conclude that, in a sense, what's happened is the patents paradox pendulum seems to have shifted more in favor of intellectual property protection rather than diffusion, and that, in a sense, we need policies either in terms of driving higher wages, higher research funding, a less favorable appropriation environment. In our research policy paper, we suggested a taxonomy of patents that would look at different classes of patents. And that this, I suppose, is a better way of spurring diffusion than some of the policies that we've seen so far. I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I would welcome any questions, comments, or suggestions on how we should take this forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christine and Damian. Absolutely interesting piece of work, which is challenging the paper on saying that innovators run out of ideas and researchers and trying to provide very plausible alternative explanations of changes in productivity and on patents and, of course, research and development. Absolutely interesting. So let's open the floor for discussion, ideas, and let me check in the chat whether, okay, no comments in the chat yet, so I can open up. I guess if you put up your hand, I will be able to see you. One of my colleagues will be able to see you. And any comments, observations, questions? As in Q&A. Okay. There is a button. We are now in the new Teams, right? There's a button for raising your hand up. Okay. In the meantime, let me, while we wait for any questions or discussions, just look at this, the measures, especially looking at researchers, and whether you are looking at researchers in terms of the number of researchers or investment in research. I suppose when you are looking at country by country, or even dividing the world into high income, low middle income, and so forth, perhaps whether adjustment is possible or whether the data is adjusted to take care of the fact that, researchers, and especially top researchers, those who innovate, may not have a national jurisdiction. In fact, they work on a global platform, and they also rotate, over time. Plus the fact that a number of new innovations are done collaboratively to the extent that this may involve researchers from North and South, or from the US and the UK, and also, of course, in the world of globalization, where companies, those companies especially which have high expenditures on R&D, they are global, and it's difficult to tie them within even a single region. And now, these wonderful patterns that you are showing, and maybe actually the definitions were in the earlier paper by the researchers you are critiquing, whether they take into account the international cross-boundary nature of researchers, R&D, innovation. Of course, patenting is done in a particular country. That's maybe it's very different. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Victor. I think
just
that's
opening up the discussion, and any one of you could shed a little bit of more light on this observation.
Thanks,
Okay.
Victor. No,
So
that's yeah. Do you want me to respond to that?
Yeah, just apologise to everyone. I have to dash off because of a meeting to do with exams that got conflicted with this seminar. So I'm going to leave.
You are breaking up, Christine.
Yeah, I'm going to leave you in Damian's capable hands as I have to leave for an exam meeting. Can you hear that? I put it in the chat.
Not really. I think, in my view, it seems to be frozen. Maybe this is my view. Meng?
Yeah, I can hear Christine very well.
Yeah. Okay. And
I've put a message in the chat, but I have to leave.
oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Hi, Victor. Do you want me to
on
respond to your initial question?
Oh, we.
I think Victor's internet is maybe. I can hear Damian very well. I think Victor, is your internet maybe a little bit interrupted?
Okay. Okay. Let me remove the camera, and maybe just to give time, let me go to Oladapo, and then we come back to Christine and Damian. Oladapo, please go ahead. You have your hand up.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very clear and precise. Yeah, but I have a question, and it has to do with R&D tax credits, in the private sector. Where does it, come into play in all of this discussion? Because really, if you think about it, the R&D spendings that we've seen in the business sector, has a lot to do with the tax credits, for on such spendings. Did you consider this in the whole narrative? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a very important observation, and of course, there are sharp differences in the use of tax credits across a number of jurisdictions. So the question is whether the differences matter in the way we arrive at different conclusions. Okay, so I'll store that and wait to have Damian on board. So I now, let me invite Pasquale. Pasquale, good to see you on board, and yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Victor. And thank you, Damian and Christine, for a very interesting paper on a highly relevant topic. Just a quick question. The data you look at are aggregate data at the level of the economy. I was wondering whether you have also looked at sectoral data on specific sectors of the economy, which maybe could help discriminate among the various alternative hypotheses that have been put forward to explain the slowdown in productivity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pasquale, for delving into the sectoral data, and especially when the standard work when to compute total factor productivity. Normally, the industries show a lot of variations in that, and maybe that could help a little bit. Okay, so maybe Damian, shall I come back to you now, and from the comments, observations from a number of people, and try to lead the discussion of giving us your views.
Thanks, Victor. Yeah, I can try shed light on some of those questions. I'll go with your comment first on researchers. I think when I started looking at this, one of the things I was surprised by was the actual lack of data on the number of researchers globally or in different countries. It does seem to be difficult, but and I suspect that might have influenced how or the construction, at least, of the effective researcher measure in Bloom. That it was easier maybe to use this measure of investment in intellectual property assets and deflate it using the wage level of sort of high skilled employees. I think it's something I'm looking at in terms of the measure, but I agree with your point, your broad point in terms of that. I suppose innovation is about global mobility or mobility of researchers. I think my experience of looking at this is, and some of the literature around this, that one thing in particular that stands out is that particularly, and we did a little bit of work on vaccines in terms of research around vaccine production, and in that sector, it seems that there are reductions in mobility. That often the research that happens around some of these products tends to be siloed in particular parts, and that there's a lot of, I suppose, care taken in a sense to prevent diffusion of some of the ideas around innovations. So there are some barriers for mobility and the protection of knowledge. But I think your overall point about whether the number of researchers is an appropriate way of catching that, I think, is a good point. I think our more basic point, well, we felt, I think, particularly with regard to the US economy, that the effective research, the measure of effective researchers, and maybe the things that are being attributed to it, i.e. a slowdown in research productivity or the production of new ideas, wasn't appropriate. And I suppose that was our big motivation for looking at the number of researchers in the US specifically. It was a sort of a byproduct of that, I think, that led us to look at researchers in other countries, and we just picked up on that relationship that there does seem to be a fairly consistent relationship between the numbers of researchers and the level of patenting. And I think the only thing we can take from that is that we're not necessarily delivering less ideas for less research or less inventions for less research. But I think it's certainly worth delving into that data at a deeper level and seeing if there are some issues, particularly around I suppose the differences, if indeed there are any, among different income classes of countries. So I take on board that point. The next question, Oladapo, I think, there's your
Yes.
question on research and development tax credits. Yeah, that's a very interesting one, particularly. I mean, I'm sitting here in Ireland delivering the presentation. I think we're one of the, if not the biggest, maybe the second biggest beneficiaries of research and development tax credits. I think, yeah, it would be very interesting if there was a way of separating the impact of that out from the tendency towards I suppose the use of intellectual property assets. I think I was talking recently to another researcher working on this area, and I mean they have, I think it's almost a stylized fact at this stage that the amount of or the proportion of firm assets, particularly in large businesses, accounted for by intellectual property assets has grown to be one of the largest components of firm assets. But again, I think that question of sort of you know, how much of that is driven by the tax credit environment, I think is a very interesting one. I wonder, though, thinking about it, if it comes more into the area of incentives, or, you know, I suppose the incentives for research and the incentives for, I suppose, using intellectual property as a way of appropriating the returns from from innovation. So again, yeah, I think that's a really good question, and you know, I think we should look at a way of separating out that effect and maybe bringing it into the whole question of how we govern intellectual property protection. Pasquale, thanks very much for that observation. I think again, I think that's an important one in terms of trying to aggregate, or the data we do use is aggregate data. And I suppose that was building on the Bloom paper. They use aggregate data in the first part of their paper to look at this. I think Christine and I have sort of discussed how we take that forward. And, you know, we have been looking at sort of company level patenting. We've also been looking at the possibility of examining this on sector level. In the Bloom paper, they take an interesting approach. They use, I think it's 3 industry level case studies and look at the generation of ideas in 3 different sectors. I think they might have used health or biomedical. I think they also used the agricultural sector, or the seed, maybe something around seed production. I can't remember exactly. And they linked these to outcome variables like life quality, extra years life expectancy, crop yields, that type of thing. I think there are some problems around that, because I think, you know, obviously we know with life expectancy that there are other factors maybe that impact life expectancy more maybe than medical breakthrough. So there might be societal or socioeconomic issues that are driving those issues. But again, it is something we have thought about, and I think, you know, again, it's a very interesting suggestion, and one we will explore in more detail.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Damian, for that engagement and giving us further insight into your work. And let me see, for more views, comments, we know this is work in progress, I guess, Damian, and as usual in some of the seminars, possible participants get further ideas, further reaction as the ideas get absorbed as you think about all this work. And of course, please feel free to reach out to us or direct it to Damian and Christine, or via Meng, who is coordinating all these activities from the background. And so that, and of course, when the paper is published, there will be information on this website so that we can engage more on this very important, this very timely and critical issue of innovations, patents, the IP, intellectual property, and productivity growth. It becomes, I say, timely, given the way economies all over the world are trying to recover from the lockdown and the impaired supply chains that were disrupted during the lockdown. Indeed, supply side issues are taking the front seat now, and going back to industrial policy on how to get economies tick. So, Damian and Christine, this has been a very, very, very timely intervention, the discussion, and to help us think about these issues. intellectual property. And yeah, thank you very much. So let me check, please. If you've been sitting on a question and issue, please let me know. I go back to the charts. Okay, and the chat. Yes, Christine had to leave for an exam board meeting, and I'll be joining shortly in the same meeting after here. But maybe before I give the vote of thanks, Damian, is there anything else you'd like to say or mention? Just final word.
No, I think I'd just like to thank you, Victor, for the opportunity to come back to SOAS, albeit virtually. Much appreciated, and thanks to everybody for interesting questions. And hopefully, at some point, the work will reach a paper, as you say, and we'll be very happy to share it.
Absolutely. It's, I think, our great pleasure to thank you, Damian and Christine, for this work. And as you recall, this is an area of great interest, and Damian and Christine have constantly, I think, every year shared with us some of their new work, and they continue to do so. And we really thank you very much. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the participants from many corners of the world, and to see also good familiar friendly faces, Pasquale and other groups who have been able to make it a point. We don't take it for granted. We know we are extremely busy, so we thank you for being able to spare an hour or two and come and share your time in this interesting seminar. So let's put our hands together and give a hand of applause to Christine and Damian for this interesting seminar, and to you for being able to make it. And we'll see you again next week. Thank you very much, and bye-bye for now.